This is Maryland Morning on 88.1. I'm Sheilah Kast. Kathleen Brockway's new book has a grand title, Baltimore's Deaf Heritage, but it feels like a family album. Brockway has done both, given us an overview of a deaf community organizing and fighting for new rights, as well as an intimate profile of families who led that community. Baltimore's Deaf Heritage is primarily a picture book, a couple of pages of text, and more than 100 pages of photographs, with captions that take us through the story. Kathleen Brockway, an advocate for deaf rights, gathered these images from the families, deaf organizations, and the archives of the Maryland School for the Deaf, Gallaudet University, and other schools. Miss Brockway, who is deaf herself, is here in the studio with her interpreter, Carrie Quigley, whose voice you'll hear. When we spoke a couple weeks ago, we videotaped the interview and have posted that video on our website at wypr.org/MarylandMorning. So if you'd like to see the interpretation as well as hear it, you can go to our website. Welcome to you both.
Hello.
I'm so glad you're here. Kathleen Brockway,
Me too.
Kathleen Brockway, what inspired you to organize this book?
Well, I began with research on George Dummy Leitner. I was going to give a presentation, and I found out that he was 3 generations of deaf and before and after. And I was totally shocked to see that there was more information that I never was aware of, and the community needed to share about that.
Okay, you've taken us immediately to George Dummy Leitner. What an interesting nickname. He was a professional baseball player, right?
Yes, he was. He was actually called Dummy because way back in the day, when there were deaf people, they called them Dummy back then. So his profession as a baseball player, he played with Dummy Taylor for the New York Giants and the Philadelphia Athletics and another team. And he did also play for preseason for the Orioles, for their team. And he would practice with them. And there was a famous manager, Connie Mack, took him before he had the chance to play for the Orioles. So then he traveled around. He didn't really have a great career, sadly. But he did have the chance to play. And then he came back to Baltimore. And he had family. And he had deaf family. And he led many activities here in Baltimore.
He was part of a group, as I understand from your book, that was drawn to James Sullivan Wells. You begin your book with James Sullivan Wells and his 3 daughters and his wife Helen coming to Baltimore in 1879. Why is the Wells family important to the deaf community in Baltimore?
When I was doing research on George Leitner, I found out that his wife, her father, James Wells, he began the deaf church that's here in Baltimore, and it's called Grace Deaf Mission. And I was interested. I investigated more, and I found out that James Wells' family was deaf. He had a sister who was deaf, and he had a deaf wife, and he had a deaf daughter. Actually, well, really, he had 3 daughters. And then he raised them after his wife died. So he was with his wife for a short time when she was here, and he taught at the Texas School for the Deaf, and he met his wife there. And then they moved to New York, and then they became a well-known family here in Baltimore. There was one, William Barry himself. He was a hearing gentleman, and he was president of the fire insurance company. And he was the liaison between the hearing and the deaf workers, and he was very good friends with James Wells. And he said, I want you to come to Baltimore and, develop here because there's a huge deaf community here and there's a lot of opportunity to socialize. So they decided to move here in 1879. And from there, one of his daughters met George Leitner and married him.
I want to ask you about the schools. There were very few schools in the Baltimore area or in Maryland at that time teaching deaf students, especially very few options for black deaf students. And there were different approaches to teaching. I gather this was a split nationally, not just in Maryland. Sign language, or what you call an oral school, is that learning to read lips?
Yes, oral means you read lips, and it's legal to use sign language in those schools. And it really restricts communication. That's a big issue. Now, James Wells, he taught at the Maryland School for the Deaf for colored youths. And that was back what it was called. And then it was in Overley, Baltimore. And first it was on Saratoga Street. And James Wells got along with the black deaf community. And he always encouraged the black deaf individuals to come with the white people for church and interact with them. But at the same time, there was still segregation. But he was very involved with both groups. And there were 3 schools back then. One was called Kendall, and that was in Washington, D.C. And that practiced the oral approach back then. The second one was Maryland School for the Deaf in Frederick, Maryland. And then the third one was Overley, and that was at the Maryland School for the Deaf Colored Youth. And then there was also an oral school that was in Baltimore, William Bear School. And less than, if you're under 5 years old, there was St. Francis Xavier School, if you were under 5 years old. So there really it was limited in what there was offered. Now, for the black deaf community, they did go to Kendall School in Washington, D.C., until they decided to segregate. So they transferred them to Overley. And they were allowed North Carolina, South Carolina, Maryland, that surrounding areas were allowed to send their students to that school.
On WIPR, this is Maryland Morning. I'm Sheilah Kast, speaking with Kathleen Brockway, an advocate for deaf rights, about her new book, Baltimore's Deaf Heritage. Carrie Quigley is interpreting for us. It's so striking because your book is so visual, and in some ways you're describing what seems like a tight deaf community, but of course the photos reflect the wider society, and until about the 1960s, all the photos are either of white people or black people, but never together. Or at least I don't think I saw one together until the late 50s. What were things in the deaf community that separate, even in the mid-20th century?
Well, really until around 1955, there was more integration in church services. Now, for the schools in Frederick and in Overley, they were all together in 1957, blacks with whites. Now, even though there was segregation, the white community here in Baltimore was always willing to communicate with black individuals, but it's not really shown in the pictures in the book.
You wrote in your introduction, many in the black deaf community could not afford certain things, including taking pictures to remember fun activities. Tell us about the significance of taking photos in the deaf community.
Yes. The black deaf community mostly worked at Cat Paw's factory, and that was on Austin Street, and that was really before it closed and moved to Massachusetts. But still, they had very limited income. And one of the children, who was from a large deaf black family, Zelphine Jennings Jones, she saved and saved her money when she was 12, and she finally was able to buy a camera with a flash. It was one of those small cameras, and she took pictures of everything. And she took pictures of everything she could because she knew that no one else could afford to do so. So the pictures that I saw were so inspiring and such personal pictures. Especially there's one of a driver, a black deaf driver. His name is Charles Christian, and it was very, very rare to own a car back at that time. And shoot, if you were deaf especially. So she took a picture of him that was just so important to have that, and a picture of the church group as well. So, wow. You know, back then it was so valuable to the black deaf community, and also valuable to identify each picture. And they preferred to have each picture identified.
She was a help to you as you were organizing this book, right, Zelphine?
Oh, yes. She helped with the photographs and identification of those photographs. And that helped me a lot to learn a lot about the deaf black community. And that was very, very important. It was so much information, and I needed to learn that.
What was the hardest part about gathering these images? And what image did you hear about that you were not able to get? There must be something that's still a mystery. George Leitner's family had so many very, very small pictures, like 2x2 pictures. You know, I mean, they were very, very small, and the company couldn't print them. And I wanted them so badly, but I couldn't get them. So maybe at least 3 or 4 of the pictures, I was lucky. We were able to have it approved. They weren't supposed to, but they approved it because I convinced them that it was very, very important. For example, James Wells, his wife, Fannie Delphine Wells, there's one picture of her. That's it, just one. And she died around 7 weeks later. And that picture that's in the book, wow. You know, with her children, her 3 children in the picture. One daughter, who is 2. She died 6 days after the mother died. Her mom passed away, and then 6 days later, the daughter did, and they were buried together. So those pictures were so important, and I was lucky I was able to convince them to print them. I remember that picture very clearly. It looks very clear. I mean, I had no idea that it
had been
blown.
Very small.
I couldn't tell that from looking at the picture.
Oh, yeah, it was so hard to scan it. It was very difficult to scan it. It was like having a negative, you know, and, you know, like a negative, when you copy it and then you have to flip it. George Leitner, his family, one of his descendants, Lee Berenson, really helped. He helped so much with that picture, with being able to flip the negative. So we were very fortunate that the company approved doing that.
You mentioned Grace Deaf Church, Grace Deaf Mission, and you mentioned the preschool that St. Francis Xavier Catholic Church in Baltimore County ran. Well, tell us a bit about what the role of some other institutional churches was for the Black community.
Well, originally, the Deaf Mission was with an Episcopal church. And James Wells, when he passed away, Daniel Moylan was a deaf man. He graduated from the Maryland School. He was very, very young, and he took over the church, and he was the lay leader for the church services. And somehow, during that time, the church did not want to become, he did not want to become like an actual pastor. So he decided to change to become a Methodist person. So as a Methodist leader, he was born into the Methodist Church originally. And so that was born 100 years ago, and it's still providing services today. And Daniel, he was very, very important in starting that church, and it's still running their services today.
Daniel Moylan.
Yes, Daniel Moylan. And he has children. Then I believe right now it's the 6th judge in the family. Judge Moylan is 6th generation in Baltimore. And he's a descendant of Daniel Moylan. He's part of that family.
Reverend Moylan died in 1943 and was succeeded by Reverend Foxwell, right, who was the son of deaf parents.
Yes, that's correct. Moylan was on his deathbed, and he was begging Louis Foxwell, and he was a child of a deaf adult, and said, "Please take over for me." And was almost like they had a mentor relationship before his death. And I believe he was a chauffeur at the time, and he drove Moylan around. So he asked him, and he was willing to take over. And he was very, very, very well known. And he was like a surrogate father to the Black deaf community, and also the white community as well.
And then in April of 1974, Reverend Foxwell was shot and killed in a robbery attempt.
Yes. It was a failed robbery attack, and it was in his driveway. And he was doing something before he was ready to leave to go to the Eastern Shore, and he was going to meet his wife there on the Eastern Shore for, I think, a vacation. I believe it was a vacation. So 2 people came up behind him, and they tried to rob him, but it failed, and they shot him. And before he arrived at the hospital, he explained to them who the robbers were while he was in the ambulance. He was explaining to them, and then he passed away. And luckily, they were able to catch the 2 guys. And thanks to his description of them before he died. And it was a very sad day, that funeral. Because people, including the Black deaf community, they were grieving. And there was one story, there was a Black deaf man, and he was riding in the bus to New York, and he was looking for a job. And when he heard that Foxwell had died, he couldn't afford the money to come back to the Baltimore area, so he decided to hitchhike. So he hitched a ride to come here to Baltimore so he could go to that funeral. And Zelphine Jennings Jones, she had a rental car, and she had so many people cramped in this one car, and she drove. There were 158 vehicles in this caravan to the Eastern Shore. With the toll booth, it went up, and there were cars coming through that toll booth so he could be buried there. So he meant a lot to so many people, including people in the Eastern Shore in the U.S.
Is there a leader in the community who came after him?
There were a few people in succession, just very, very short periods of time. But right now it's Reverend Sandy Johnson, and she runs that church now. And that's on South Beachfield Avenue in Baltimore. And there's a sign that says Methodist Church for the Deaf on the sign in front of the church.
You mentioned in your introduction that one of the challenges the deaf community faced was driving rights for the deaf. How did that unfold?
Yes, Maryland School for the Deaf, the superintendent, Ignatius Jolie, he was a hearing person who was involved with the deaf, and he fought for deaf driving rights, including Rosal McCall, and that was Leitner's nephew. So he helped write to the newspaper, and for example, the car insurance companies, a long time ago, back then, they refused to provide car insurance to deaf drivers. And then one interesting story, Simon Carmel, he grew up in the Baltimore area, and he went to the Miracle Vehicle Administration, the MVA, with his mom. And she was ready for the driving test. I guess it was in the 1940s, the late 1940s. And they went, and the person who worked there said, okay, you're deaf? Okay. And the person brought over this box. It was almost like a Monopoly game, the board game, like a toy game. And it had little cars, like toy cars, that you would move around. And that person told them to move the cars around to test their intelligence. So they were like, not sure what this is. So they moved the cars around as they were instructed. And they said, okay, you passed the test. So now you can actually take the test, the driving test, and then the road test. And he passed it. And it was like, you know, they were just obsessed with that concept. Very interesting.
So it was really more the test than concern that deaf people would not be safe drivers once they passed the written test.
Probably. They just wanted to see if he was smart enough to go ahead and take that test first.
And this was about when? What year?
Well, he went into Gallaudet around the 1950s, so it was probably the late 1940s to early 1950s.
And since then, has it been fairly straightforward for deaf people to be licensed as drivers?
In the 1920s, they also had deaf drivers. And they had to have a chaperone, a hearing chaperone, sitting in the car next to the deaf driver. And that was back then.
This was not necessarily someone who was licensed to drive him or herself.
Yes, they could drive themselves, but they still needed a quote-unquote chaperone sitting next to them.
But I mean, did the chaperone have to have a license?
I didn't ask, but I believe so,
Oh.
Yes.
We've spoken about some of the leaders in the deaf community. We've spoken more about men than women. I have the impression from the photographs, though, that there were some women leaders. Tell us about one or two.
Yes. George Leitner's family, who I mentioned previously, they had leaders in their family. And I guess, you know, they were natural-born leaders in that family. For example, there was Clara Wheeler McCall. She was married to Roselle McCall, and she was very, very active in the deaf church. And she led the music, the choir in the church, in sign language, of course. And she was very active in the deaf community. Various activities, cookouts, festivals, all that. And George Leitner's daughter, Helen, not his wife, Helen, his daughter named Helen, she married August Write. And she was very, very active. She was a secretary for the National Association for the Deaf and the Maryland Association for the Deaf as well. And also, Blumenthal, there was a husband and wife, the Blumenthals, both of them. They were very active in the Jewish community. And they have a Jewish deaf community here in Baltimore as well. The Jewish deaf community back then tend to have more social gatherings because their temple in the early period, while some did not allow deaf people to come into the temple. And that happened later on. They were allowed in. So, for example, the Blumenthal family, they fought to teach sign language classes at their temple. And they were successful with that. And they were able to get that through. And there were several more leaders. Also, there were 2 black men that were very, very important but had not been recognized. And they took over when Daniel Moylan passed away. Jerome Horsey and Charles Waters. The 2 of them were not sure what to do with this, so they started a church service that was for black deaf in the community called Whatcoat Mission, and that was at their house. They just kind of moved around to various houses, and that was before Foxwell. So, he encouraged people to come to his church, and they went to the service, but still there was segregation at that time. So Foxwell had to serve the black community, and then at a different time, the white community. And then Foxwell decided, it's time, 1955, to integrate. And the white community had no problem with it because they'd been integrating with the black community all the time up until then. So Foxwell is the person who really made them look up to him.
You close the book with a poster for a sign-a-thon in 1978, and it has a character wearing a T-shirt emblazoned Deaf Power. Is your book a chronicle of deaf power?
Well, no, not really. I posted that because I found it very interesting because people thought that that symbol, covering your ear and your arm up, was 1988 is when it started for the deaf president now occurrence at Gallaudet. But when I saw that, I was, wow, that was in 1978. So it happened way before that sign with covering your ear and your arm out with a fist. I couldn't find proof when it really started, but I found it very interesting to have that picture. And I talked with Marcia, and that was Daniel Moylan's, one of his children, the wife. And she told me, she said, yes, that was in 1978, and that was way before anyone utilized that in later years. So I found that very interesting. So I posted it in the book.
What do you most hope people who read this book learn from it?
Well, I'm hoping to recognize more deaf names because really deaf history books really don't mention any of these people. And also, for example, Wikipedia of sports players George Leitner, you know, they're hearing books and you see pictures, but there's only one picture, and it's the worst picture of him ever. It was very dark. You couldn't even see his face. So this book is really the first printed picture that has a real good picture of him. So I'm sure sport collections people out there will be very excited to see that picture and say, oh, that's what he looks like. So I'm hoping that they will be willing to replace the picture in Wikipedia of sports player. And also then the Hall of Fame here at the museum here in Baltimore. And other people in the deaf community, the Black deaf community, have been recognized in my book as well. I want that.
Well, I appreciate your walking us through it. Thank you.
You're most welcome.
Kathleen Brockway wrote and organized Baltimore's Deaf Heritage, one of Arcadia Publishing's Images of America series. We've got information about the book at our website, wypr.org/Maryland Morning. More of this interview there, too, and the video of it. Carrie Quigley interpreted for us. Brandon Block has been our videographer. I'm Sheilah Kast. More ahead on Maryland Morning. Stay with us on 88.1. What else do you wish we'd talked about?
I would probably do more books. I mean, this has helped me decide. Hopefully each city where there are large deaf communities, because I've already started doing some research on South Dakota, the Sioux Falls area, and I've been researching more other things like that. And it's just fascinating. And it's hidden. You know, it's gems of deaf history that people are not aware of or haven't written about.
Did things unfold differently for the deaf community around Baltimore or in Maryland than in other places?
Well, not totally different, but there are some differences. For example, this area in Baltimore is well known grassroots. You know, Washington, D.C. is not really grassroots. You know, so here, Baltimore and Washington, D.C., the kids and the deaf community, they're raised differently. So, and I'm more fascinated with the grassroots community, and that needs to be recognized as well.
Raised differently in what ways?
Well, family values, status, you know, the relationship and how they stay together. Their signing is different.
There's a Baltimore accent in signing?
You know, so, and all states have different signs. Yeah, quote unquote, there is a Baltimore accent in signing. I was raised in many different states myself, so I grew up and I had to change my signing to fit the community where I was. And that was very hard. So when I researched this book, I understood about that totally, because they were very different than the outside deaf community. And the 1900s, it's interesting because one person mentioned that where her best vacation was Baltimore because of the deaf community. And she was at it was in the Maryland School for the Deaf. It was one of their publications because it was one of the biggest deaf communities back then here in Baltimore. And it was a very cohesive community. And it's interesting that all were divided. There were the oral community, the signing community, and both of them really didn't meet each other. I mean, there were small groups, but they just didn't meet each other until perhaps, well, the oral people, I guess, started to see sign language, and they said, oh, I noticed you signing. And that was probably when they were in high school.
So this would have been about when?
Well, for example, Simon Carmel, he was in high school in, I think, 1950s. and he started to see at the swimming pool other deaf people. And he'd be, wow, fascinated with those people, that sign language. So they taught him the ABCs because he had been raised orally. And he started signing fully when he went into Gallaudet University and has been signing ever since. And he's just been signing ever since Gallaudet. And he's never looked back to his oral beginnings. And then another person, Harriet Gross Blatt. I'm sorry, wrong name. Goldberg. She was raised, and she was not allowed to sign. And she went into high school, and there were no interpreters there. So she had a really, really difficult time getting through. You know, she had note-taking. They left her alone, and her family left her alone. And the interesting thing is that her family forbade her to sign until recently. Her mom had a funeral. She had passed away, and that was last fall, I believe. And she hired an interpreter, and her family was totally shocked that she had an interpreter to communicate because she didn't want to be left out of her mom's funeral. And there are so many more stories, and I would be happy to tell you. I could talk all night long.